Many of us share the same regret. After your parents have gone, you realise you wish you'd asked them more questions about their childhood and early life. Well, luckily for me and my sisters, Therese and Geraldine, my brother Richard did just that and recorded an interview with my father on video. This was recorded a few months before our father died in 2002. We didn't know the end was so near at the time. By way of introduction, our father was Donald Jones, and he lived as a child in Ferndale, a mining town in the Rhondda Valley in the 1920s and 30s. His father, Austin Jones, my namesake, was the coal mine's senior engineer, a professional role that provided tied accommodation. His mother, Irene, had been a schoolteacher until the family came along. Our father lived a happy and full life, happily married to Brenda, who was the homemaker and mother to the four of us. Our father was able to pursue his career. He was a chartered civil engineer, and at retirement at 60, he was the chief engineer of British Transport Docks Board, working in London. The family remains his lasting legacy: 10 grandchildren and currently 14 great-grandchildren. Richard's interview with Dad focuses on our father's early life and wartime military career. Dad was commissioned into the Royal Engineers and led a platoon on D-Day +2 in June 1944, landing at Arromanches. His role was to build and anchor Mulberry Bay, an artificial harbour that allowed all of the follow-on Allied forces to land safely in support of the military invasion. I'll let Richard and Dad fill in the detail.
A few questions, so for posterity, we know about Ferndale and your family. When were you born?
I was born in 1922. I'm 79 years old.
Your birthday being?
The 17th of July.
How many were in your family? Or are in your family?
My mother, my father, myself, and my sister Nesta, who's 5 years younger than me. There was a baby who preceded me named Norman, who died 2 years before I was born, aged about 18 months.
How would you describe your father?
Very calm man, very intelligent man, very nice man, with a good sense of humour, a very kind man, and we all loved him.
And how would you describe your mother?
My mother was a tiny woman, but full of energy. As a young child, she'd been rather delicate and had been sent into the country to sort of gather strength, I suppose you'd say. But all her life, she pursued life with great energy, and she became a school teacher. She went to a teacher's training college at Cheltenham, and then came back and took a teaching job in Ferndale, actually in Blankshire, which is the other side of the valley from Ferndale. And there she taught until she married my father in about 1919. In those days, women teachers had to resign the teaching jobs when they were married, which of course she did. She never worked after that, except to run a household very efficiently. She was a good disciplinarian, but very kind, and had a great respect for her and loved her.
Where did your father and mother actually grow up?
My mother grew up in an adjoining valley. You know, the Rhondda Valley, the Rhondda Valleys, to be strictly correct, are fair. She grew up in the larger of these valleys, in a small mining village known as Ton Pentra, over the hill from Ferndale. My father was a Monmouthshire man, born in Bryn Mawr and brought up there. He studied hard as a young man and became a chartered mechanical engineer. After that, he worked in various mining towns and met my mother when he came to work in Ferndale.
How many brothers and sisters did your mother and father have?
Well, my father had three brothers, Ivor, Jack, and Gus. And he had two sisters, Rini and Nella. My mother had three brothers, William, Dewey, and Jack. And one sister, Rebecca.
So did you have a lot of cousins growing up there?
I had cousins. I wouldn't say a lot of cousins. On my father's side, I only had two cousins. My cousin Phyllis, his brother Ivor's daughter. They only had one child. And my cousin Neil Thumpston, the daughter of Reen and her husband. They only had one child. On my mother's side, I had several cousins from my mother's sister Rebecca. They were Basil and John, Alwyn, Gwen, and Aline. Her brother Dewey had two sons, Pleniv and John. I had no other cousins, first cousins.
How would you describe the village where you grew up?
The village was a nice village. The Rhondda Valley, the Rhondda Bach, the smaller valley where Ferndale is about 6 miles long. It's quite a narrow, steep-sided valley, except at Ferndale, where the valley widens out to the extent that it accommodates quite a nice park and even a lake. The town itself of Ferndale is built on one side, on quite a steep slope. On the other side is a smaller village known as Dainllechai. Now both villages depended entirely on the coal mines for income for the families. But it was a pleasant town, a happy town, and there was unlimited freedom for youngsters, especially boys, on the hills, which were not fenced or in any way restricted. And I must say, my childhood, I thought, was a very happy one there.
As you grew up in Ferndale, were there any events you would describe as that characterised or made an impact on you during life?
I think the first thing, looking back, that I remember made an impact was a total eclipse of the sun must have been about 1928 or 29. And I can remember that as a child of about 7 years of age, with others, getting a piece of glass, plain glass, and smoking it over a candle, and at the appropriate time in the morning, looking at the sun through the smoked glass. I don't particularly remember the eclipse as such, but I do remember the excitement that went with it. The next thing that I recollect, standing out in my mind, when the local miners' leader, a communist named Arthur Horner, was released from Cardiff jail after serving 1 year's imprisonment for some political misdemeanor. And he travelled by train from Cardiff to Porth, where the valley started. And from Porth, he was surrounded by hundreds of miners. I should say nearly all unemployed at that time. It was 1931 or 32 at that time. But from Porth he was carried shoulder high to Marley, stopping at Ferndale to make a speech. And I at that time was living not in the house where I was born, but in another house on North Road. And I was excited seeing all the crowds cheering Arthur Horner as he was carried up to Marley. He was quite a formidable political figure in those parts. After that, of course, the outbreak of the Second World War and the armistice or armistices which followed. The first, the European armistice, I was in Europe, still in the forces. But for the second one, I was on leave in Ferndale, and I remember going down to Cardiff, joining thousands outside the City Hall, singing and waving and being enormously excited at the significance of the final end of the wars.
Going back to Ferndale, how would you describe your schooling?
My schooling was very good. The Rhondda Valleys and Glamorgan generally had good educational policies for most of their children, and fortunately I came in that group. After infant and primary school teaching, there was an examination that had to be passed to secure entry to the secondary schools, or county schools as they were then called. And once you were there, your education continued until you were about 17 or 18 years of age, entirely free, and it was a good education. has always stood me in good stead. I had good teachers, a good young headmaster who was appointed more or less when I went in as a young boy of 10 and a half. And he remained headmaster during my time at the school and for many years afterwards. I can only speak most highly of the school. I enjoyed my stay with them, and they educated me well.
Okay. Okay. How did you feel on the outbreak of the Second World War?
Well,
Having only been 18 years after the end of the First World War.
the First World War left terrible, not exactly memories, because I and my peers weren't born until after the war was over. But we were aware of the losses that every family had suffered, the deaths and injuries, and the hardships, and the books and articles that had been written about it, a dreadful loss of life. And so it was frightening, terribly frightening. Before Britain declared war on Germany in 1939, we were made aware through the news and the press of Hitler's activities, and he seemed to be incapable of restraining his demands to dominate as much of Europe as he could. So by the time war was declared, we had been prepared for it. It didn't come as a sudden shock. I and my family happened to be on holiday in Torquay on the day before war was declared. Our holiday was coming to an end, and we drove home from Torquay to Ferndale the day before war was declared. The following morning, we heard the Prime Minister, Mr. Chamberlain, announce the declaration of war on the radio. There was a lot of activity in the next few days, because we were anticipating almost immediately air attacks, and we'd seen on the cinema news programs what had happened in Spain and China, and knew what could happen if you were attacked from the air. And we had, as quickly as you could, to protect the windows of our living rooms of our houses from the effects of shattering glass by pasting paper onto them. And at the same time, we had to devise means of totally screening any light being shown outside when the light was turned on in the rooms. We already did have a system of air raid wardens who patrolled, and you soon heard shouts from a warden and a knock at the door if by accident you had put a light on in a room which was not shielded from letting the light out. So There was a lot of that activity. But as to air raids, apart from an alarm that went off in London, the siren sounding shortly after the Prime Minister's declaration of war, the war was virtually silent for the best part of a year. There were no activities by our troops or German troops, or by their Air Force or our Air Force, which made much impact on us.
What part did you play in the Second World War?
Well, I was a student at college. I cut short my higher school education because conscription had been introduced, so that all young men would be conscripted into the forces at the age of 20. By cutting out shortening my higher level education at school, I was able to go to college at 17 years of age. This allowed me 3 years to take my engineering degree, by which time I would be 20 and would be conscripted. In the event, whilst I was at college, the age for conscription was reduced from 20 to 19, which meant I did not have the time to complete my degree. But for certain classes of degree, and civil engineering was one of them, you had the opportunity of volunteering for the forces and appearing before a military recruiting board, known as the Joint Recruiting Board. And you were interviewed there by 2 colonels. They assessed you, and you volunteered for a specific arm of service. And they then had the authority to grant you 1 year's extension to allow you to complete your degree. At the end of which you entered the services as a volunteer, which is what I did.
And what arm of the forces did you go in?
Well, I entered the Corps of Royal Engineers. My entry was delayed for some months because I suffered a bad bout of pleurisy, and this was picked up in an examination, a medical examination, after I left home to join the forces and was examined at Pontypridd at the recruiting department. I had not paid much attention to the pleurisy, but they discovered it and stated they would not pass me as fit to go in. And I was to see the tubercular specialist of South Wales, a man named Dr. Heidi. This man I saw, and he said, "You are not fit enough, I will defer this, and I will see you again in some months' time." In that space of time, I applied for, and explaining the circumstances, I got a position with the Great Western Railway at Taunton. After about 6 months, I saw Dr. Heidi again, and he then said I was fit enough to join the services, which I did.
Where did you serve in the army?
Well, my initial training, of course, was in Great Britain. First of all, as an officer cadet in I joined the forces and donned uniform in Chatham in number 7 Training Battalion RE. And from there I went to Ruta, which was an area where hundreds of officer cadets were trained in military training. So all arms were trained there: infantrymen, artillerymen, Royal Engineers, Corps Signals. From there I went on to a pre-officer cadet training unit at Gravesend of the Royal Corps of Engineers. That was followed by Octu Proper at Newark in Lincolnshire. And there I had 26 weeks of energetic and education in the skills of military engineering until I was awarded my commission. After that, I was posted for a short while to Andover, and from there I was supposed to do a special unit training to erect a military port on the coast of France, later known as Mulberry, to allow British forces to land for the second front, the invasion of Europe. That was a very secret operation, and it began with us gaining experience in the equipment at Sandwich, the port of Sandwich in Kent, where we assembled components and prepared them for their tow across the Atlantic, across the Channel. After that, we went to the Isle of Wight, where in the Solent we assembled the piers to simulate what we would be doing in France. After a few weeks, we were all, that is, all the individual officers of the company, were briefed on our future movements. For myself, I was briefed in a cornfield by Colonel Sainsbury, who told me my destination would be Armanches. To help me remember it, he drew on a piece of paper, in pencil, an arrow, a little cartoon figure of a man, and a little diagram of a chessboard. Arrow, man, chess. He said that I would receive no map, and no man in my unit would be aware of this, and I was to keep it as a total secret. and not to discuss it with other members of my own unit. He then destroyed the piece of paper. A few days later, my platoon and I had 66 men, a platoon sergeant, several corporals and lance corporals. We set off and crossed by ferry from the Isle of Wight to the mainland. There we were put into one or two sealed up transport vehicles and taken to what were called concentration areas, which were tented camps, some were in the country, where we were contained, and we were not allowed to leave those areas. I should mention that just before I left on that little journey, all my kit, except what was called Scale C kit, that was the kit you carried into battle, was loaded up into kit bags, and a little later it was dispatched without any explanation to my parents at home in Ferndale. And as I wasn't able to communicate with them, they were quite worried when that happened. That was their worries were soon put to rest. I was in the concentration area for 1 or 2 days when the invasion was announced. And my platoon was taken by vehicle, or vehicles, down to Gosport and allocated a street of terraced houses. We sheltered there overnight. There was some slight rain. We sheltered in doorways of houses through the night. And as dawn approached, my platoon sergeant came to me and said, people are aware that we're standing in the doorways and they've been inviting our sappers in for some light breakfast. Can they do this? And I said, yes, they certainly could, providing that's all they did. So that if we received a sudden order to move on, a bang at the door would bring them out. And so the people of that street, whose name I don't know, were very kind to us all. And shortly after breakfast, we moved down to Gosport Hard, a slope extending into seawater. And then we marched up the ramp of a landing ship tanks, an LST, quite a fair-sized vessel. I had no vehicles, only a platoon of men, 66 men. So we marched on board, and we were allocated space at the bow end of the ship, just below deck. And we squeezed into whatever we could squeeze into as far as space was concerned. There were no bunks or anything like that. And waited. Ship was at anchor then. And in the night it moved out across the channel. And I must have fallen asleep, because I was suddenly woken by a terrific noise that hadn't been seen to be happening all around me. and I leapt out from where I was perched. And then I realized that I'd been lying right under the anchor chain pipe. And it was the dropping of the anchor and the cable going through it that made such a terrific din. And once the anchor was down, the cable ran out, of course it was quiet again. Well, sleep was beyond me after that. So I went up on deck. It was a nice night then. And I think I just cleaned my revolver and thought of all sorts of things. And we sailed on to France. We arrived at the beach we were due to land in the afternoon of D+2. And we anchored off the beach. In the sea there were warships and rocket ships firing volleys of shells and rockets over the beach to the German front, which was about a mile inshore. And we waited developments. I was then ordered to go over the side with another platoon of Royal Marines. So we clambered down on the kind of nets that they throw over the sides of those vessels, and we clambered down into the small vessels which were going to put us on the beach itself, or close to it. Once we were all in that, these small landing craft, in our case one landing craft, made for the shore. I thought it would go in closer than it did. And I did mention to the NCO in charge of it, why did you go a bit closer in? And he said, well, the tide is on the ebb and if we should be nicked by it, I wouldn't be able to get back. So the ramp was lowered into the water, and we literally jumped off into water about chest high. And there we waded ashore. The beach was quite deserted. We'd heard there would be marshalling officers there to direct us here and direct us there, but I never saw any. So I had a chat with my platoon sergeant, and I knew, and I had already told him, that the road we wanted to reach was separated from the beach by sand dunes, a few hundred yards. And these dunes were mined, and clearways had been cleared by sappers or others, had been marked with tape. So I said to the sergeant, you go up the beach that way for a couple of hundred yards, and I'll go down the beach this way for a couple of hundred yards, no more than a couple of hundred yards each. And then we both come back, compare what we've seen. So when we got back, I said I'd found no clearways at all, no tapes. And he said, well, he had, but he'd only found a single tape. Now, our drill as Royal Engineers in clearing minefields was to lay two tapes, 12 feet apart, I seem to remember. So we went up to where these tapes were, or in this case a single tape, and I said, well, somebody has laid this tape. So we'll single file our way up to the road along this tape, which is what we did. And we got to the road, and I knew that all I had to do then was turn right and head for Aramonch, which is some miles away. That falls now?
How successful was the building of the harbour at Aramonch then?
Well, the building of the harbour was totally successful. All the units were put together without any problem. One thing that was done, which was very wise, very prudent, was the anchoring of the individual pontoons which supported the bridges. Each pontoon was to be anchored by what we call an upstream anchor and a downstream anchor. A special type of anchor, which could be laid by a small craft, and the two anchors were connected by about 1,500 feet of strong steel wire, which was anchored on the pontoon, both sides. Now, when we were assembling the elements, the weather was calm. Then we were instructed to double or treble all these anchors, which we did. And it wasn't difficult to do this because the weather was calm. And we set out all these different anchors. There were certain parts of the beach where anchors couldn't grip. And there were various other devices for securing a hold on that hard sea bed. Then we were struck by a summer storm of great intensity. It tore at all sorts of things and broke them adrift. The bridges themselves stood up splendidly to these forces. Where they were most at risk was from other floating craft or objects which were under nobody's control and which would hit the bridge like battering rams. Now the steel pontoons could stand this, but quite a number of the pontoons were actually built of quite thin reinforced concrete. This was due to a general shortage of steel. When the bridge elements are being fabricated in Britain. Now, when a concrete pontoon was hit, a hole was punched in it. And it didn't have sufficient buoyancy if several holes were hit in it to stop it from sinking. It so happened that some miles away, the Americans had built a similar harbour to ours, Mulberry, and their piers suffered irreparable damage. So much so that they had to consider their prefabricated harbour could no longer function. But what they did was they said immediately salvage anything here that could help you repair your damages. This is what we did. We couldn't change anything during the storm, but after the storm was over, we methodically replaced all the concrete beams, the steel ones. And from there on, the harbour functioned as it was designed to function, and was instrumental, the bridges and pierheads were instrumental in bringing tens of thousands of tons of military and other stores ashore to support the armed forces on the beachheads.
And what was your specific responsibility in that of your platoon?
Initially, I was the officer in charge of 3 repair parties. These 3 repair parties were really on 24 hours notice to cover any damage incidents that happened day or night. And there being 3 repair parties, of course, we managed to do this. Although it was very hard, a very tiring work, with very little time for sleep. But nevertheless, they were able to successfully do what was required of them. After the storm was over, the design of the harbour was to a certain extent changed. There were originally intended to be 3 long pierheads, 3 long bridges, some 5,500 feet long, out to the pierheads. They decided that they would serve only 2 long bridges out to pierheads, and the other would be a slightly shorter pier, still 1,000 feet long, to handle a lighter kind of traffic. And I had responsibility for that pier. I helped in its construction and thereafter in its maintenance and management. And the situation remained until ultimately the harbour was dismantled. And the components were loaded up and taken to Caen and unloaded and stored on the banks of the Caen Canal. As a matter of interest, a schoolboy friend of mine, Bill Brooks, a school teacher, who by that time was the naval officer in charge of an LCT, a landing ship for landing craft tanks, played a role in accepting some of these components and shipping them to Caen. Because I didn't know that at the time, and he didn't know that I was in that area anyway. But we've since discovered that.
Where did your war service take you subsequently?
Before I answer that question, I just want to say that many of the pontoons that were stored on the Caen Canal came to serve a very important role in stemming the breaches in the dikes which protected the Dutch island of Walcheren. The dikes had been demolished by Germans in retreat, and further damaged by British airborne assaults. Closing the gaps had proved to be very difficult. I served for a while in a unit that was engaged in helping the Dutch overcome this problem. But ultimately, the solution was found by dumping these pontoons in the gaps. So they served a secondary and very useful purpose. And you asked that question again?
Where did you subsequently serve when you were in the army?
Well, I anticipated this to a certain extent, but once the port was dismantled, the unit was, to all intents and purposes, disbanded, and men and officers were posted to different units. I was posted to Holland, where I joined a company engaged in helping the Dutch to preserve their harbour at Walcheren. Winston Churchill was very conscious of the great damage done to the Dutch economy by British assaults, and our work in Walcheren was part of his policy in trying to repair as quickly as possible the problems the Dutch were facing to allow them to get back to normal life. I was in that part of the country when the European War finished. After that, I was posted back to the United Kingdom to Sandwich in Kent. Our company was scheduled to go to Okinawa to take part in the final assault on Japanese mainland. We had sent an advance party ahead, and these were already on their way. To Okinawa. We then went on invocation leave prior to sailing. During that invocation leave, which I spent with my parents in Ferndale, I heard on our radio set from an American program broadcast in Europe the first news of the bomb at Hiroshima. And I heard this at least an hour before any news appeared on British radio news. Well, within 24 hours, of course, the second bomb had been dropped. The Japanese had capitulated, and the war was virtually over. This news was met with great relief, as it was known that the assault on Japan would have been a very bloody one indeed. So after the invocation leave was over, I rejoined members of my unit, and we were posted to Hull on detachment, where we assembled Mulberry Pierhead units in the Humber to act as berths for ships bringing back demobilized troops from Europe. Remained there for a month or two. Then I was posted to the Middle East and went first to Southampton, where I joined a draft of 200 men. These were, in the main, 200 new recruits. They were not a unit. There were no NCOs. They were not in platoons or companies or anything like that. And I and 3 other subalterns were, as it were, the wardens for the journey out to the Middle East. So we had to set up some organization and select and appoint temporary NCOs, corporals and NCOs, corporals and lance corporals, to give the men recognizable leadership in groups. And we sailed on an American troopship from Southampton through the Bay of Biscay, stopping at Gibraltar on the way because there was some engine trouble with the ship, and suddenly discovering after years of rationing that there were places in the world where there was no rationing. And this came as a great, marvelous surprise to us. No matter what you thought of, the local restaurants could provide it. We were there several days, able to go ashore every day. And then we went to Cairo. We had a few days to meander about, see the pyramids and museums and so on. And then I was posted to Egypt to a company in Suez. And I stayed there a few months. Then I was posted to the Lebanon, to Beirut. Beautiful city, as it was. Overlooked by lovely hills, mountains, snow covered for most of the year on the tops. And I was several months there, many months. Then I was posted to Palestine. Now Palestine was in the middle of a lot of problems with the Jewish residents and the Palestinian residents.
While they briefly served there, the region still does not have peace. Dad was demobbed shortly after this and returned to his career as a dock civil engineer with Great Western Railway and British Transport Docks Board, rising to chief engineer. He was happily married to my mother Brenda for more than 50 years. We will always remember him full of fun and stories, especially holding audience at Sunday lunches with extended family and friends.